Hello, this is Ben, and today we're looking at a Task 1 line graph. Let's read it together. First of all, the graph below shows the consumption of fish and some different kinds of meat in a European country between 1979 and 2004. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Write at least 150 words. Now, I usually recommend that you read the essay on your own first. I'll show you each slide so that you can do so and think about which kinds of scores you think it would get. And then when I tell you what I think it could possibly get at the end, we can see how similar our predictions are. So this is the first slide. This is the second. And this is the third and final one. Just to remind you, as always, when scoring, you should use the Writing Task 1 band descriptors, which are available online. This is the public version, so public is for everyone. Like public transport is for everyone, this is public. So a quick Google search will help you find this. It might be a little bit small on this screen, so you can maybe print out a version. When we talk about it together at the end, I'll zoom in so we can see a bit more clearly. Okay, so without further ado, let's take a look. So it's weekly fish and meat consumption basically eating. So we can assume that it's the weekly average for one person per week. So it's not everyone in the country together eats an amount that comes to this. It's one person. And the unit of measurement is grams. The period in question is 25 years, quarter of a century. But it's all in the past. It's not future predictions. It's not until now. That will affect the grammar that we use, as always. Let's take a look at the answer that I got from one of my students. So the introduction, very short. The given line graph illustrates the amounts of fish and 3 different types of meat eaten by people in one European nation over a period of 25 years from 1979 to 2004. This is a kind of interesting thing. We're thinking about how to define the things. 3 types of meat and fish. The confusion is with the word meat. Sometimes meat refers mainly to red meat. Beef and lamb would be red meat. Chicken's what we call white meat. But to be exact, meat refers to anything from an animal, the flesh of an animal that's consumed for food. So really they're all meats, if you want to be exact. So we could just say 4 kinds of meat. But the problem is people generally think of fish and meat as being a bit different. So some people will say, I don't eat meat, but I eat fish. That's called a pescatarian, not fully vegetarian. But it's not exactly right. So really it's 4 kinds of meat, but it's a small point because of that confusion I just mentioned. So I'm not going to change that part, even though I think it might be slightly better. One thing I will change is I'll change amounts to quantities. And the reason why I'll do that is there's a focus here on measuring something in grams, giving measurements, and we tend to use quantity for them. Amount, on the other hand, is usually for uncountable nouns that we aren't really measuring. Like if I have a plate and I put a lot of food on that plate, then that'll be a large amount of food. I'm not really measuring it. I'm not weighing it. I'm not thinking of the exact size. But here the focus is on measurements, quantity. It can be an uncountable noun, it can be a countable one, but the focus is on measuring it. And that's why I'm changing it here. I'm not using my red pen, I'm using my black pen. That means it's an improvement rather than a kind of bad error. One European nation, yeah, it's true. Maybe I'll just add that it's unspecified which one it is. It's unnamed or unspecified. An unspecified European nation over, I'm going to say the period of 25 years from 1979 to 2004, because it's a specific one, like the period spanning the years 1979 to 2004. We could just say over a period of 25 years, but we're defining it. So when we define things, we usually use the specific period between that year and that year. So moving on, in general terms, it can be clearly seen that people's consumption of chicken increased, while beef's consumption decreased throughout the period shown. The phrasing beef's consumption is a little bit awkward. It sounds like the beef is eating something, not that someone is eating the beef. So it's a bit more normal to say the consumption of beef, like the consumption of beef by people. But we've already used the noun consumption, so we don't want to repeat it. So we'll just use the word that. That's kind of being used as a reference word to replace consumption. So it's kind of being used as a pronoun there. And we just have to follow the preposition that's of beef. So while the consumption of beef, while that's of beef, decreased throughout the period shown. What problems do you think there are with this overall summary of what it shows? There is a big problem. It's not that what it's saying is wrong. It's just that we have 4 things: chicken, beef, lamb, and fish. And only 2 are being discussed: chicken and beef. So, especially because the trends are so clear, like beef and lamb both go down, chicken goes up, fish remains relatively stable, there's no reason to avoid talking about them all. So I would just write a comment. What about lamb and fish? There are only 4 things. It's easy to talk about them all. It's not like there are a huge number of things to talk about for this one. So moving on, turning to the graph in more detail, let's just add, it can be seen that, it's evident that, it can be observed that, it's evident that in 1979, about 220 grams of beef eaten by Europeans in a nation during a week compared to lamb, chicken and fish, which consumed about 150, 148 and 52 grams per week respectively. So that's a little bit awkward to read, isn't it? We've got problems with the cohesion. Think of the cohesion as like the glue that connects everything together. We want the writing to be smooth, and this is not. So let's go through the problems. So the European people ate beef, so beef was eaten by European people. Now this is a bit confusing because it says grams, so we could say grams were, or we could refer to the beef and say was. As far as I know, both are acceptable. I'll go with were in this case to refer to grams. Were eaten by Europeans Well, I'm going to delete by Europeans because it's people in one specific European country, even though that European country is not named. It's not specified which one it is. And again, there's only one we're talking about. So in the nation we're talking about, in the nation in question. It's a specific or defined one, so we use the. So we're eaten in the nation. I could argue that about is a little bit informal. It's more speaking style. Approximately is more formal, but not a big deal. So I'm not going to correct that. I don't want it to be too messy. And yeah, during a week. So that's an average. We're not talking about one specific week that was recorded. It's average per week. So let's add that. We're eaten per capita. On average, per capita, basically just per person in the population for a country, per capita on average in the European nation during a week. Compared to is not really being used correctly here, is it? We can say people in Spain ate a large amount of lamb compared to people in the UK. But we're not really using that kind of grammar or that kind of comparison. So let's change it. Whereas while lamb, chicken and fish. The relative pronoun which to replace it or they or them is not being used correctly here. Well, these three types of food were consumed, I'm going to say, at rates of about 150, 148 and 52 grams per week, respectively. So respectively is for that order. So lamb is the first one mentioned, that's for that. Chicken second, so for the second figure, and fish third, so for the third figure. I would start with the smallest one, so I would say fish, chicken and lamb, rather than lamb, chicken and fish, because in English it looks much more normal to start with the smallest and go to the biggest. Where I'm living at the moment, it's a different country, different culture. And usually in this country, in this language, in the country's language, they put the highest number first. So it looks a bit weird, so I would change that. But again, I don't want it to be too messy. Rate is a word that's often misunderstood and used incorrectly, but it's okay here. Rate is kind of when you have something like an amount or quantity or something. Number, some kind of figure, and kind of time is factored in. So it might be rate of crimes per year, like annual crime rate, so marriage rate. And here we're talking about kind of quantity per year. So, quantity per week with yearly averages. So we're talking about the rates in terms of grams per week. And that's why it's okay here. So moving on. By 1989, the amount of chicken consumption had risen by about 40 grams. This is quite nice. Sometimes we use by and past perfect. Past perfect, subject plus had plus pp. So in this case it's rose, and pp, past participle risen. So had risen by about 40 grams. And we do this if we're just highlighting changes between two specific times in the past. So we've been talking about a previous time. By this time, this change had happened. So we can check that. That was for chicken. So from 148 grams, it should be to 188, roughly. Very specific to say 148. You can't be exact, can you? Better to say just under 150 grams. Or possibly even approximately 140 grams. 140, 130, 20, 10. Yeah, probably about 140 grams, right? And by 1989, it'd gone up to around there, maybe 190, so increasing by about 50, I would say, rather than 40. These are so specific, I don't know that I would be so specific. It's hard to measure exactly. And lamb, chicken, 150, 148, not really. It's more like 150 and 140, isn't it? From what I can see. If we zoom in a bit, I feel pretty confident with that. 3, 4, 5. Yeah, I would say roughly 140 there. So no need to be so specific there because you might just end up being wrong. Okay, so moving on. Actually, before we move on, maybe I'll just add the average weekly amount. Again, quantity is better than amounts, but I think it's okay here if we're talking very generally and we want to change the words so we're not repeating quantity too much. So by contrast, again, beef and lamb's consumption sounds weird. It sounds like beef and lamb are eating. So consumption of those things, of beef and lamb, had fallen to about 200 and 100 grams each. And what it means is really respectively. We've talked about the meaning of respectively already. And I can understand that the writer doesn't want to repeat the word because we've already used it. But it's better to repeat the word than use a word which is incorrect. And each is incorrect here. Each has a different meaning. So much better to repeat the word. But if you don't want to repeat the word, you just skip it the second time. Because the first time, I've made very clear that this is the style I'm using. I'm doing it in order. So if I then mention two things and give two figures, logically the reader just assumes it's the same, thinks it's going to be the same. So what I sometimes do is I do it the first time, and if I do it again in the next sentence, or very soon after, I just skip it the following time. It is a very useful word to organize information, because when you're writing 150 words in 20 minutes, you have to be very concise with your words. Concise means not wasting words, and this is a good way to do that. But again, there are many, many different ways you can organize your information. For example, I could say for the former and for the latter, talking about them that way. Or like I said, in this case, just skip it. You don't have to do it every time. Certainly do it the first time. In the meantime, the quantity of fish eaten almost remains more or less the same. So it's good that the writer's using quantity here. In terms of style, more or less means approximately, but it's more speaking style, so it's a stylistic issue. It's an issue with what we call register, which is how formal or informal the language is. And it does stand out because the writing style has been very appropriate in terms of the register so far. So when you suddenly get this idiomatic expression, more or less, it really jumps out at you. Let's say relatively steady. And in that case, I don't have to say almost, because it's not almost the same, it just remains relatively steady. It didn't change much. And moving on to the last slide. Between 1989 and 2004, so That's good. It's kind of changing the words not from to, using between and, between this year and that year. The figures for beef and lamb experienced a drop. Well, drops would be slightly better. Talking about two drops of 130 grams. Again, respectively, or just skip it. Then we've got this really short sentence, those for chicken ascended to about 120 grams, so why not just have a nice complex sentence there? Make it one sentence while. We're only talking about one here, so it's not those, because it's one, it's that, while that for chicken ascended to about 250 grams. Again, about sounds a little bit formal. A little bit informal. I think approximately is the best one, then roughly is also quite good. A bit more natural than ascended would be climbed. If the writer wants to change the words, ascend is used usually in different contexts to mean go up, like ascend a staircase or something. But the figure rises, grows, increases, and climbs is okay too. Meanwhile, the quantity of fish eaten fluctuated and almost remained stable. Yes, it did, but very, very tiny fluctuations. I think we have to mention that to talk about the overall trend. Fluctuated very mildly. We don't use the word mild much in Task 1 language, but there is some special language for fluctuations. If it's fluctuating a lot, you can say, for example, wild with a W, wild fluctuations. If it's very gentle, you can say mild fluctuations. So moving on to the scores, I would give this. I came up with all sixes. 6 overall, 6 for each part. Why? So task achievement addresses the requirements of the task, but I didn't think it presented a clear overview of the main trends, which is a shame because I thought a lot of the essay was very good, and it had a very clear structure. But as we mentioned, it's not really giving clear overall trends for the 4 different kinds of meat. And that would have been very easy to do, so it's a wasted opportunity, really. Cohesion and coherence, 6 also, arranges information and ideas. Arranges information and ideas coherently. Yes. Clear overall progression, yes. But cohesion within and or between sentences may be faulty or mechanical. Not really mechanical, not repeating the same structures all the time. But faulty. I'm thinking mainly of things like this, using those instead of that, and things like this, using compared to rather than while, using which incorrectly. It's a good effort to make long, complex sentences, which you need to do to get a very good score, but it's not done exactly right here, as you can see. So overall, we end up with 6 for everything. So vocabulary, adequate range of vocabulary for the task. Attempts to use some less common vocabulary, but with some inaccuracy. I think that's pretty fair. There's some very good language here, although it's a little short, so I wonder whether it's 150 words. I feel maybe it could change the language a bit. You could just say people ate or consumed a certain quantity on average, or people ate an average of blah blah per week. And that's not really done. It's kind of consumption, kind of overused slightly. But there is very nice language, trying to use quantity as well as amount, talking about the figures more generally, experienced drops of organizing information well with respectively, which is related to cohesion too. And the reason I didn't give it 7 was I thought there wasn't really enough flexibility with the language. And there was mainly one issue with style, which is the green part there. But I thought this was maybe a high 6. I would give it 6+ if 6+ were possible. But it's not, so I kind of ended up just with a 6. But there was some good language, I thought. Overall, it was good. It was just maybe it could have been developed a little bit more. I'm not going to count the words, but it seems like it might be a little bit short, possibly. And finally, for grammar, uses a mix of simple and complex sentence forms. Yeah, it does, but I don't think there's enough variety with complex structures to get the 7 score. Like I said, using the very short sentence here seems like a bit of a wasted opportunity. You just put it all together in one sentence. So there are nice linking expressions like by contrast for cohesion. And there are attempts at complex sentences, like using which over here as a relative pronoun, but it's not really done correctly. So that's the problem, unfortunately. Okay, so I wonder how closely your predicted scores align with mine. As always, thank you for watching and listening. Goodbye.